Hello class and welcome to a new analysis of If My Darling by Philip Larkin. This poem invites us into an unsettling thought experiment. What would happen if the speaker's girlfriend could see directly into his mind? The poem's main themes are psychological honesty, the gap between a social respectability and inner reality, and the destabilizing power of existential truth. If My Darling was written in May 1950 and appeared in the collection The Less Deceived. Let's move on straight to the analysis of the title, If My Darling. The opening word, if, is a conditional that immediately frames everything that follows as hypothetical. The entire poem exists in the realm of imagination, and the speaker never actually allows his darling inside his head. It is all hypothetical. Then the phrase "my darling" deploys endearing diction, which creates an intimacy that will follow in the rest of the poem. The warmth and tenderness of darling makes the revelation of the speaker's inner world all the more unsettling. Now let's move on to the first stanza. Please pause the video and read it for yourself before we start the analysis. So as you have read in this opening stanza, the speaker introduces the central hypothetical. If his girlfriend were to look beyond his surface and enter his mind, what would she discover? The stanza sets up the entire poem's premise. Well, as you have seen, the first stanza starts with the words, "If my darling," which is the exact title of the poem, which we will therefore not analyze twice. However, "were once to decide" is a highly interesting past subjunctive. Once more, the past subjunctive expresses an imagined and unlikely possibility, not something happening in reality. It signals that the poem follows a thought experiment, something that the speaker imagines but never permits. Then we have a simile in "like Alice." It is a simile and also an allusion to Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, in which a young girl falls headlong into a strange and irrational underworld, governed by bizarre logic and disturbed imagery. Larkin uses this allusion to compare it to this hypothetical situation. Just as Alice tumbles into a world she cannot comprehend, so the speaker's darling would fall into a mind that operates on similarly unsettling terms. And finally, in this third line, we have an extended metaphor that will populate the rest of the poem. In "Into My Head," the speaker's mind is imagined as a physical space, a room or underworld that can be entered and explored. Finally, the diction "floating skirt" is an allusion to Tenniel. So Tenniel is one of the more famous illustrators of Alice in Wonderland. And so it alludes to his illustration of Alice in which her dress billows upward as she falls. The lightness and innocence of floating contrasts with the oppressive imagery that follows throughout the poem. So Larkin directly establishes a tension between the girlfriend's lightness and the speaker's interior darkness. And let's now move on to stanza number 2. As always, I'll leave you a moment to pause the video, read the stanza for yourself, and form your own opinion. So as you have read in this stanza, the speaker catalogs what his girlfriend will not find in his mind. And this is immediately shown by the anaphora, so the triple repetition at the beginning of 3 clauses of the word "no." Each "no" is a negation, a denial. The speaker, with insistence, denies that some things or objects reside inside his mind, inside his head. He lists these absences with absolute precision. And what is actually missing from the speaker's inner world? Well, we have a lexical set of tables and chairs, mahogany, claw-footed sideboards, and undisturbed embers, which all belong to the semantic field of Victorian and Edwardian domestic comfort, so furniture. They are the furnishings of a respectable bourgeois interior in the 19th century. Their collective absence from the speaker's mind signals that his inner world contains none of the stability or social respectability that such pieces of furniture represent or symbolize. His inner world is much more unsettling and harrowing than the stability of a Victorian home. And this is immediately alluded to through the adjective claw-footed. So claw-footed is actually a real furniture term, but claw introduces a predatory and animal connotation that we will see later in the poem as well. And finally, we have symbolism in undisturbed embers. This word symbolizes domestic peace, a fire allowed to die quietly, warmth contained and controlled. Their absence from the speaker's mind implies restlessness, agitation, and discomfort. And as always, I'll leave you a moment to pause the video and read the third stanza for yourself before I start with the analysis. So much like stanza 2, this stanza continues the negative catalog, moving from furniture to the social rituals and class markers of a comfortable upper middle class household. So this stanza really deepens the poem's central theme by insisting that not only respectable objects and pieces of furniture are absent, but also that the entire social world they represent is equally missing. We once more have, obviously, an anaphora with the repetition of nor. This repetition extends the anaphoric pattern from stanza 2. And the shift from no to nor is slightly more formal and literary, giving the list a more mournful quality. Each item in the stanza once more belongs to the same semantic field of Edwardian and Victorian domestic comfort. First of all, we have a tantalus. A tantalus is a cabinet for drinks, usually with a lock. So this signals there would be no indulgence or no easy pleasure inside the speaker's mind. The fender seat cozy alludes to a cozy and warm seat, so there would be no warm and comforting seat by the fireplace, none of the physical ease of a well-ordered home. But there would also be no small printed books for the Sabbath. There would therefore not be any respectable and devotional home life culture. And even the butler and the housemaids are missing. There would be no human warmth or domestic life, no servants behaving in a familiar and slightly flawed way. Every item in this list is a specific and deliberate absence, each one closing off a different form of comfort, pleasure, culture, or human warmth. Kind of messed up the order of the slides, but Tantalus is an allusion to the mythological Tantalus, condemned to desire what he can never reach. And as mentioned earlier, there are no books for the Sabbath. So the word Sabbath adds a moral and religious weight. There are no books of devotion, implying a respectable moral framework that the speaker's mind entirely lacks. And then we have the lexical set I was talking about, but explained a bit too early. Let's now move on to the fourth stanza. Please pause the video and read it for yourself before I begin the analysis. With stanza 4, the poem makes its decisive turn. Having established what is absent, Larkin now begins to describe what is actually present inside the speaker's mind. And therefore the stanza kicks off with a volta. She would find herself. It's the first time that Larkin is expressing himself without using the negation. Not wouldn't, but would. For 3 stanzas, the speaker had catalogued absences. Now he begins to describe presences. The poem changes direction here, moving from what the mind is not to what the mind terrifyingly is. And this is immediately shown through diction in looped with the creep of varying light. The girlfriend of the speaker would not merely observe these lights, but she would be encircled and ensnared by them. The word looped suggests entrapment and encirclement. And as you have understood, we are already here in the speaker's mind. The girlfriend has plunged into it, and immediately she's being entrapped by it. We then have personification as the light creeps, moving with the stealth of something predatory. This personification indicates that the speaker's inner world is not passive, but active and threatening. We then have a lexical set with monkey brown and fish gray. Both draw on the semantic field of primitive animal life, contrasting sharply with the high cultural domesticity of the poem's earlier stanza. Then the diction infected introduces the language of disease and contamination. Then the simile loitering like bullies compares the threatening shapes of the speaker's mind to menacing social presences, such as bullies, who intimidate without necessarily acting. There's also a personification of the circles which loiter like bullies. To loiter means to hang around with intention and menace. So these circles are not merely shapes, but presences with will and aware of the intruder. There's also an escalation in coagulate. The biological word coagulate describes the thickening of blood or fluid into a clot, and its use here suggests these presences are on the verge of solidifying into something worse. There's a gradation from a mere threat to imminent action. We're now past the halfway mark as we move on to stanza 5. Please read it for yourself by pausing the video. So in this stanza, the speaker names his mental contents more explicitly. Delusions and a floor that feels like the stretched skin of a grave. First of all, through a metaphor, delusions are imagined as physical things which with measurable size, making abstract psychological disorder concrete and visible. We then have a hyperbole, as the delusions are compressed to the size of a glove. This is an extreme hyperbole which captures how intrusive thoughts can seem briefly small and manageable before flooding his mind again. And these delusions then sicken, which is once more a personification. The delusions acquire the qualities of something ill and contagious, which spread outward like an infection. We then have a gradation. The movement from shrinking to spreading outwards is a sequence of increasing intensity. First, the delusions are contained, then overwhelmed. This makes the danger much more imminent as the delusions which were briefly manageable then become something that cannot be stopped. Then we have a powerful image, as Larkin says that his girlfriend, or the speaker's girlfriend, would also remark the unwholesome floor, as it might be the skin of a grave. So this is obviously a simile. The mind here is imagined as a place with a surface that looks ordinary, but underneath is something deathly and disturbing. And this is really an interesting symbolism, as the floor, the most basic surface of any domestic interior, becomes something that barely conceals death beneath it. The very foundation of the speaker's interior, symbolized by the floor, is mortally compromised. And once more, please pause the video and read stanza number 6 on your own before we begin the analysis. So in this stanza, the speaker inventories some of the most disturbing contents of his mind. He most notably describes a feeling of betrayal rising from below, a violently degraded classical idea, a fixation on money, and a container of discarded finer feelings. First, we have an adhesive sense of betrayal ascending from the depths of his mind. And this is obviously a personification, as an abstract feeling ascends from beneath. The sense of betrayal behaves like something physical, rising and adhering. It does not merely exist, but moves, climbs, and clings. Indeed, this sense of betrayal is adhesive. It can attach itself. It can cling on to things. Applied to an emotion, it shows that this emotion is like a substance that sticks and cannot be removed. We then have a wonderful example of bathos, as Larkin starts describing a Grecian statue, which is then kicked in the privates. The Grecian statue symbolizes beauty, reason, and artistic aspiration. This beauty and sensitivity to beauty once existed in Larkin's brain, or in the speaker's brain. However, it is degraded as it is kicked in the privates. The mind desires beauty, desires art, civilization, but it also destroys its own ideals. And this explains why the word money is included right after this bathos. And the euphemism in privates softens sort of the crudeness of it, but it also adds a schoolboyish register. And in the final line of the 6th stanza, we have irony. Finer feelings, which is genteel language of the respectable world of the poem's earlier stanza, so stanzas 1 to 3, where we talked about Victorian mansions. And this word really collides with the swill tub, which is a bucket of kitchen waste. It reflects how, although Larkin is forced on the outside to maintain social respectability, so finer feelings, in reality, these are contained in a swill tub, a grotesque sort of container. The inner reality of Larkin's mind is in absolute contrast with the finer feelings he presents himself as having on the outer world. And then, but most of all, is the poem's second volta. It signals that everything described so far, however disturbing it might be, is not the worst revelation. And what is the worst revelation of Larkin's mind? We'll see that in stanza 7. Please pause the video and read it for yourself. The worst thing inside the speaker's head is not the grotesque imagery, but a voice, a ceaseless voice, reality itself, reciting truths that are each immediately cancelled by their own rebuttal. And we see this immediately with the connotation of the word recital, which is a word often used in the artistic world, but even in the judicial one. So this recital as you see on line 2, is intoned by reality. So, aside from these wild and surreal thoughts lingering in Larkin's mind, there is an incessant voice, to use a word employed by Larkin, an incessant voice that keeps on humming, which is reality itself, which desperately tries to keep sanity and ground Larkin's mind in reason. The word incessant really conveys unrelenting pressure, something that never pauses or gives relief. Then we have a personification, as reality intones this recital. It speaks in a low, formal, and almost liturgical register, which cannot be argued with or escaped. And this verb, to intone, belongs to the language of religious ceremony. It gives a sort of authority to the voice of reality. And reality's discourse is larded with technical terms. So this is really a metaphor, because this phrase, larded with technical terms, treats language as something edible and indigestible. To lard is to insert strips of fat into meat before cooking, making it rich but heavy and difficult to consume. Applied to language, larded suggests that reality's recital is stuffed with clinical and cold terminology that weighs it down and makes it impossible to absorb, to fathom comfortably. And the stanza ends with a wonderful antithesis: meaning and meaning's rebuttal. Every single statement of truth uttered by the voice of reality is met with a rebuttal. It is met with its own negation. For everything that means something, the meaning is instantly cancelled by the speaker's mind. And we also have a wonderful metaphor in double yoked. It is a domestic image drawn from the terminology of eggs. A double-yolked egg looks normal, ordinary from the outside, but contains a contradictory double interior. It is the perfect image or symbolism for a meaning that cancels itself. And finally, the last stanza, stanza 8. Please pause the video and read it for yourself. The speaker explains the ultimate consequence of reality's statements being instantly cancelled by his own mind. It's that the world itself is being unpicked and dissolved into emptiness. Here, the word bulletin belongs to the language of official public communication: news dispatches, government announcements, and military reports. Its use gives reality's voice an authority once more. The voice of truth, the voice of reality in Larkin's mind is like a trusted figure of authority, an official broadcasts of uncomfortable truths that cannot be ignored. And in this sense, the onomatopoeia skirl imitates the shrill and piercing sound of this voice. The internal voice of truth feels physically assaulting. It is invasive and a cutting noise that assaults the mind directly. And this voice of reality unpicks the world like a knot. So like a knot is a simile. The world's coherence becomes something that can be undone by a single patient pull, just like a knot. We then have a parallelism in the past is past and the future neuter. The past here is closed. There's an absolute finality of what has been. It is inevitable and cannot be changed. The future, on the other hand, is described as neuter, which is a grammatical term meaning neither masculine nor feminine. It is used to suggest that the future is blank, without warmth or promise. This parallelism makes the twin emptiness, so of the past, which is past, and of the future, which is neuter, so indistinct and unreadable. So this parallelism makes the emptiness inescapable. There is nowhere to turn, nowhere to go. Once more, we have a modal verb in might, which preserves the poem's conditional frame. And it also serves as sort of an understatement to limit the power of the following words. The voice of truth might knock my darling off her unpriceable pivot. So here, pivot is a metaphor. A pivot is the fixed point around which everything turns. To be knocked from it is to lose the very center of one's orientation. Larkin is here saying that by exploring the sheer confusion of his own mind, his girlfriend will become totally dazzled and will probably lose completely her orientation in a dizzying exploration of the speaker's inner world. And we have now finished with the actual poem. Let's move on to rhythm, structure, and form. In terms of structure, the poem has a clear tripartite structure. The first movement, which goes from stanzas 1 to 3, establishes the hypothetical premise and catalogues the domestic comforts absent from the speaker's mind. The second movement, stanzas 4 to 7, reveal what is actually present in the speaker's mind: a grotesque, diseased, and self-contradicting interior. And finally, in stanza 8, we have the third movement, which delivers the existential conclusion. The contradiction between the speaker's mind, confused mind, and the voice of reality in the background makes the world around him completely incomprehensible and indecipherable. In terms of form, the poem consists of 8 tercets, so stanzas of 3 lines each. And the consistent 3-line form gives the poem a regular visual appearance that ironically totally contrasts with the disorder of the subject matter. The formal regularity mirrors the speaker's socially respectable exterior, his outside appearance to other people. However, the chaotic content mirrors his inner reality. Finally, in terms of rhythm, there is nothing really to note, as there is no rhyme scheme and the poem is written in free verse. Finally, we move on to the conclusion with this picture of Alice in Wonderland. The poem has 3 main themes, the first one being the gap between social appearance and respectability and the inner reality. The 3 opening stanzas catalogue, through negation, all the furniture of Edwardian domestic comfort: the mahogany sideboards, the Sabbath books, the Tantalus, the butler, and the housemaids. Whilst these things exist on the outside appearance and perception one has of the speaker, they do not exist in his inner world. In their place are infected circles and the skin of a grave. We then have the theme of psychological disorder and self-knowledge. The speaker maps out his own mind with clinical precision. Disease, infection, and corruption dominate the central stanzas. The speaker sees himself exactly as he is and conceals it precisely because he knows his inner self. Finally, existential nihilism and the limits of meaning. This is the deepest theme, certainly philosophically. Every truth inside the speaker's mind, uttered by the voice of reason, the voice of truth, of reality, is double yoked with meaning and meaning's rebuttal. The past is gone, the future is neither, so blank and without promise. And the entire world has lost its meaning due to contradiction. And on that very deep and philosophical note, I'm going to end the video. Thank you for having watched. Please follow, subscribe, comment, like, and I'll see you in the next one.